Shabbat Shalom. World War I. Young Lieutenant Shapiro, lieutenant, he's British, is given the assignment to sneak into no man's land to scope out the enemy defenses before the next big push. Eventually, he comes back crawling into the British trench, and the general asks him, what did he see? He says, well, on your left flank, General, sir, they have a dozen machine gun nests. And the general says, oh, dear. He says, no, it's okay. Our artillery will tune in and we will obliterate them. Good point, Mr. Shapiro. On the right flank, General, on the right flank, they have a dozen artillery pieces. Oh, dear, says the general. No, don't worry, says Lieutenant Shapiro. Our new tanks will race across no man's land and they won't be able to track them and wipe them out. Good point, says the general. And the middle? No, General. No, Lieutenant Shapiro, I have to know what is in the middle of the enemy's defenses. He says, I can't tell you, it's too horrible to mention. He's like, Shapiro, if this offensive is going to be successful, I need to know everything. He says, in the general, in the middle they have the biggest dog. It used to be a lot funnier if you knew that Jews used to be a lot more afraid of dogs than they are now. In fact, there was a day when Jews were not the common dog owners that we see today, and the idea of a dog was often very scary. However, we should point out that being scared didn't stop Jews from around the world, especially from this country, from serving in the army and serving in the military in many different capacities. And on this Memorial Day, we have to remember them. We have to remember those who gave their life in the ultimate sacrifice for the defense of the countries on which they fought. Courage is not something that is easy. Courage is something that fails very simply sometimes. And we see in the earlier section of this Torah reading, one that we didn't read publicly together, but which, if you're all doing your job, you read on your own during the week. Have a little courage and open the Torah on your own sometime. We see a balance between blessings and curses, as they are usually referred to. During the blessing section, it says that our enemies will be put to the rout. Excuse me, this is driving me crazy. There we go. Our enemies will be put to the rout before our soldiers. That during the time when we are blessed, 5 will give chase to 100. Imagine that. 5 soldiers chasing after 100 soldiers who, in their terror, will run away from these soldiers. On the other hand, in the Tochacha section, in the rebuke and the curses, there will be times when our hearts will be faint, when we will be terrified at the sound of a leaf. That just the rustling of a leaf will set us to flight and panic. Which one seems more likely to you? Just as a quick survey. You don't have to raise your hands. I'll just look around and I can tell by your faces. Do you think that 5 people will be able to chase after 100 enemy soldiers into success? Is that likely? Or do you think it would be likely that people would be so scared of their own shadow that even the sound of a rustling leaf would make people abandon their posts and flee for safety? Anyone wants to give their opinion, that's perfectly fine. But I'm not demanding an opinion. If you are like an average person, and sorry, this is just twisted and it's taking my ear with it, and with my ear, my concentration. Despite outward appearances, I'm actually trying to think about what I'm saying. Let's see if that's any better at all. Some weeks it just doesn't seem to set on the ears, and I don't know why. I guess I picked the wrong ears out of the cupboard today. If you are like the average person, then chances are you find the second scenario much more plausible. The idea of 5 people setting to rout 100 people, come on, 20 to 1 odds? all the other soldiers have to do is turn around, look, they'll see there's only 5 guys, and they'll spin, and the spears will be out, and that'll be the end of the 5. I mean, who's going to run away from 5 guys when you've got 99 of your friends standing next to you? The idea that someone might be so afraid, indeed an entire community or country might be so afraid, believing that they are on the verge of losing to the superior enemies that are out there, that their courage might have been sapped, to the point that a little rustling in the bushes while they're on guard duty would send that person running, and when they see that person running, the comrades will run with him, assuming that he has been attacked, and when we see a bunch running, now the rest of the army is going to run, and boom, all of a sudden everything has been lost. That seems plausible. The problem is, of course, is that as human beings, we are terrible at knowing what is likely and what is unlikely. We are terrible at risk assessment. If you ask the average person, do you think that there is more or less crime this year than last year? Guess what the average answer is? More. For the last 50 years, that has been the overwhelming majority response. If anybody here has actually studied crime statistics, you'll know that that has been a ridiculous response for a large portion of those last 50 years. Especially from the 1990s onward, for the last 30 years, crime fell off a cliff. The amount of crime has plummeted in this country to the point that you are less than half or a third as likely to be susceptible to a criminal attack, whether it be property or violent crime, compared to where people were in the 1980s. Now, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I remember the tension. You know, when you're walking downtown, well, you didn't walk downtown, because that was just a stupid thing to do, and that was in San Diego, let alone for places like Chicago or New York. But now, the crime rates have been dropping. Yes, there has been an uptick in the last couple of years, and something that demands additional research and understanding of why that might be going on. But even the uptick we have seen in the last few years is a fragment of what crime used to be in the 70s and 80s. It's even still less than what crime was in the 50s and 60s for most urban environments. And yet we act as though the army is coming to get us. We run at the sound of a driven leaf. We are bad at predicting how much risk we face from different threats in our society. Now, one of the reasons we're so bad at it is because biologically, evolutionarily, it pays to jump at the leaf rather than thinking you can chase down 100 guys. Because if you are sitting around the campfire in some Neolithic society and there's a rustling in the bush behind you, you could either ignore it and go on cooking your little bit of rabbit, or you could jump up, grab your spear, and go, ha! If you're wrong, and it is just another rabbit in the bush, okay, no harm done. If you are wrong and sit there, and it turns out there was a tiger in that bush, well, you're not going to be around to have any children, are you? And that means those who were low-key on their sensitivity to danger tended to get weeded out of our population. We as a species, despite being predators, we're a little jumpy. And we overestimate the danger that we are in because for much of our history that has been a successful strategy. What's the worst that can happen if I jump up and go, at the bush with my spear? I waste a few calories that I'm going to have to go find somewhere else. Remember, that used to be a bigger deal for people that didn't get their calories from the supermarket, but not so bad. Better I should be oversensitive than insensitive. Unfortunately, that means that our overtuned monkey mind perceives threats constantly everywhere, especially when it is catered to us. That is to say, because we respond to negativity, danger, and threats much more than positivity, peace, or tranquility, most of those who are in the business of sharing information with us for a profit will give us what we are more sensitive to. We are much more likely to tune into a news story about a disaster than we are to tune into a news story about a blessing. It is simply the way our minds work, if we let them. Because the problem is, letting that monkey mind make all the decisions for us means we don't make very good decisions. And yes, when it was just us, our spear and the bush, the false negatives and the false positives, we could work that out. But when we are jumping not with our spear and not at a bush, but jumping at each other, when we are at each other's throats in our society, we notice the stakes have gotten a little higher. And we notice the capability for harm to one another has gotten higher. Because we have decided it is not the bush and the potential tiger that is our biggest threat, but each other. And when we perceive each other as our biggest threat, even though statistically, scientifically, it is not, unless you're a child, I should point out, this last couple years is the first time in human history that human violence has become the leading cause of death for children. But for the rest of us, we vastly distort our perception of reality by imagining that the people around us are our biggest threat. We are running from a leaf. We are flinching. And as we flinch, our community dissolves, it crumbles. We need courage. We need the courage to simply face the reality that by and large, most of us are going to live, thank God, boring lives. Exciting to us individually, joyful, God willing, for most of us, but as far as the news is concerned, most of us should never get into the newspaper for more than a couple sentences to simply mention, so-and-so opened a new business, or so-and-so was, seen at Disneyland having a great time on their new ride, or some other mundane type story which is not going to capture the headline. For most of us, that is all of the notoriety we will receive. There's 0.0001% that is going to get a different type of notoriety, but most of us will never meet those people either. Most of us will never come into contact with a violent offender. Most of us will never come into contact with a thief. Most of us will not come into contact with a direct form of property damage. I'm sorry, most of our lives are boring, at least as far as the media is concerned. And we need to recognize that and work to improve our quality of life rather than defending ourselves against the leaf that is rustling. We need to have the courage to say, this is a problem, but it is a problem that needs to be resolved in and of itself, not because it is an existential crisis for all of us. It is a problem because anyone suffering is a problem, but anyone suffering is not the same as everyone suffering. And when we decide that it is everyone suffering, then we increase the suffering, because now we are moving into bunker mode. Now we circle the wagons, now we begin to exclude others, now we begin to harden ourselves rather than protecting others. And this is how the Torah describes the disintegration of our communities in the earlier sections of Bechukotai. As people begin to turn further and further away from God and from the community and from the gift of the commandments which guide us to live a beautiful, blessed, and generous life, of course, the final stage is we will jump at a leaf. Why wouldn't I? Whereas before I had 5 friends that side by side we could charge an army, now I am alone, shaking in the dark, holding my spear, believing that the next sound I hear will be the coming of my death. And of course, a society like that will collapse. And of course, Jeremiah in the Haftarah describes a society on the verge of such a collapse. And we know from history, indeed, he was right, as the Babylonians were able to steamroll us because we had rotted ourselves from within. And so too later, when the Romans came by. Time and time again, it has been our fear that divides us and our fear that allows us to actually be harmed from threats we are no longer capable of managing. So what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is, as I've said multiple times, reasonable precautions that need to be taken, and attention to all that can be done to solve a problem. But we also have to balance that monkey mind which tells us danger, 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 when in fact we are not in danger. And there are a number of different techniques that are advocated for by our tradition. One is simply to have reasonable assessments of the danger. If you are going to get on a boat and the boat looks dangerous, don't get on the boat. If the boat looks safe, get on the boat. If there's a big storm, don't get on the boat. If there's no storm, get on the boat. Most solid boats in most clear weather will return. It's not that hard. Additionally, our tradition tells us that sometimes we need to realize that the danger and harm that we are so keyed to notice is actually not all that bad. Yes, I am guilty of being frustrated daily on the roads around Orlando by the crazy drivers. There are lunatics aplenty. Well, actually, come to think of it, usually there's maybe one a week that gets my real attention for that person is driving badly. And yet in the 12 years that I've been here in Orlando, I've only ever had one accident because someone failed to stop at a red light. Does that mean that everyone on the road is a lunatic? No. We might act like it, we might say it like that, but indeed, they're not actually that bad. And as someone who's driven in Los Angeles, as well as in Washington, D.C., let me tell you, they're not that bad. And they are predictable, which means, generally speaking, most of us are able to drive routinely without the consequences of the few rare lunatics that are out there. If that weren't the case, we would all be huddled in our houses, afraid to go out on the roads. And yet we continue to complain about the traffics and the crazies and all of that. And again, I take full responsibility. I am guilty for that as well. Because when you see something that looks wrong, we tend to overinflate it. When we see it once, we tend to imagine it happened 100 times rather than only once, and 100 times it was fine. And that balance is so hard to achieve. But I'd like you to just, for a moment, try to think of the people that you actually know. I know it's hard, right? We have this catalog, this Rolodex, for those of you old enough to know what that is, your contact list if you're a little bit younger. Think of the people you know. How many of them are psychopaths? Not including you. I'm willing to wager on most people's list, 0. How many of them have told you about an actual psychopath they know for your extended circle of people? Also, I would guess, very, very few. If you think about them, are they generally, most of the time, mostly nice? If they're in your Rolodex, probably they are. They're probably not going around burning down forests. They're probably not going around kicking puppies. They're probably not going around stealing candy from babies. I am willing to wager, and I will take this bet after Shabbat on anyone who wishes to, that if we looked through your contact list and you told me about who each person was, assuming you could remember how they got in your phone, what you told me about them would be 90% positive, and the 10% would be what's known as a personality difficulty, not a danger. Why do you imagine the people you know are not the average? I know we're all above average. Put that in your statistics calculation, but we can't all be above average, or then there's no average. Okay, well, we'll work on statistics more later. I can see there's a need. Right, we are all above average, and so of course all of our friends are better than average, are more atypical. But look around. Do you think the average person that you see standing at a bus stop, the average person who's behind you in line at the supermarket, the average person that is there in the DMV at the same time you are, do you think that average person is a psychopath? Do you think that average person is a dangerous person? Or do you think that average person is a nice person trying to do what they think they can to help themselves and their family? in a way that is perfectly within the normal bounds of society. Yes, we get video after video after video, because we have phone cameras everywhere, of some lunatic berating the poor person at the desk of the DMV or the cashier at the supermarket. It's become such a wonderful trend. And we all tune in to look at the buffoon. But let's be honest, this is 1 out of 1,000,000 person. Or this is maybe a 1 out of 100,000 person who is having currently the worst day of their life and has snapped, unfortunately, and cannot walk themselves back from the place they've gotten. They can't get their monkey mind to climb down out of the tree that it's gone up. But are they actually dangerous? By and large, no. Most people, most of the time, are mostly good. We have to remember that. Most people, most of the time, are mostly good. And I'm not talking most meaning 51%. We are well up into the upper 90%. For most people, most of the time, are mostly good. Our society could not function were this not the case. If 50% of the people drove 100 miles an hour every day on the roads of Orlando, we'd all be dead. If 1% drove 100 miles an hour, 1%, 1 out of every 100 cars you pass on the freeway was going 100 miles an hour, we would all have had an accident by now that would have landed us in the hospital. If 1 out of 10,000 do it, we can survive. And indeed, I'm sure the number is even less than that. But we don't feel that way, do we? We are hyper-attuned to the threat. We think crime only goes up and up and up, failing to recognize that for looking around the average age of this room, for most of us, we are living in a safer environment today than at almost any other point in our life. And yet we don't feel it. Because we have been fed a steady diet that told us, be afraid, tune in at 11. Be scared, buy my book. Don't believe people who say things are fine. Look at this outrageous behavior, like and subscribe. We have been duped into missing the blessings we have been given. When God laid out the blessings and the curses in the beginning of Bechukotai, I don't imagine God ever thought that we would be so stupid as to not be able to tell one from the other. To be living in a time when we are being showered with blessings, and to think that we are living in a time that is cursed. God could not have predicted that, even with God's infinite wisdom. And yet here we are. Does that mean the world is perfect? Obviously not. Does that mean our country is perfect? Obviously not. Does that mean there's nothing left to do to make the world better? Of course, there is more to do. But to imagine that the world is currently sitting at the gateway to hell is equally wrong, equally naive, and in many ways more dangerous. Because people that are scared do terrible things and make terrible decisions. Allow yourself to look at the situations around you, not from fear, but from compassion and from generosity. What can we do to improve the situation, because it deserves to be improved, and no one deserves to go through the tragedies that they go through? Not because I am afraid it will happen to me, but because I want it to happen to no one. Not because I am panicked and feel like that cowering monkey in the tree, but because I am a compassionate, spiritual human being who simply wants to lift others up from any potential threat they may face. But I do not have to be anxious for myself to be concerned for others. I do not have to feel panic before I care for another. If I only will help a situation because I am personally afraid, I feel personally threatened, then what kind of person are you? Allow yourself to feel the safety and security of this beautiful, blessed congregation, this beautiful and blessed country for which so many people have sacrificed so much to give us the land that we have. And from that place of safety and peace and gratitude, reach out to prevent any more tragedies from happening to anyone, no matter how rare, no matter how obscure, no matter how unlikely. No one should suffer, and we that are not suffering should be there to prevent it. Shabbat Shalom.